So welcome to Unit 9, Developmental Psychology, and this is Module 47, Infancy and Childhood, Cognitive Development. It's a pretty long module, but we'll try to get through it rather quickly. And if you're just joining this channel, these modules align to Myers Psychology for the AP course 3rd edition. So the learning targets should be able to describe how a child's mind develops from the perspectives of our probably the two of the most important developmental psychologists of all time, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, and today's researchers are going to be also talking about. And then to be able to discuss autism spectrum disorder and its effect on development. Sorry for that dinging noise. So there he is, Jean Piaget. He was so interested in understanding how knowledge grows. How is it that we learn? How does knowledge develop over time? And while he started off as a biologist, he was actually, sort of a kid genius who published his first article at age 11 and went on to publish many before he was even like 15 years old. And he started off studying in biology, and then he did a little work in the lab of Alfred Binet, if you remember from the intelligence module, who was developing the first intelligence test. And from his work as a biologist, and then within the, studying kids' answers on intelligence tests, and then with working with his own children, he became fascinated with understanding the unfolding of knowledge development. And he spent his life searching for a better understanding of how we learn. He studied the development of children's cognition, which are all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. So Piaget's studies led him to believe that a child's mind develops through a series of stages. So it's important to remember when you're thinking about Piaget, he was a stage theorist. He thought that the child's mind developed through these stages in an upward march from their newborn simple reflexes to the adult's abstract reasoning power. So you could think about how an 8-year-old can comprehend things a toddler can't, and how an adult can understand things that a child cannot. And so instead of thinking that it was just a quantitative increase in knowledge that we get, sort of a continuous quantitative increase in knowledge, Piaget believed that there were qualitative differences in the way that people understand the world around them, depending on what stage of development they were in. Piaget's core idea was that our intellectual progression reflects an unceasing struggle to make sense of our experiences. And he talks a lot about schemas and how the maturing brain builds schemas, which are concepts or mental molds in which we sort of, if you think about it, you want to make a concrete example out of what this means. It's how we pour our experiences into a mold, which is important. A schema, this idea or model for a doggy, for a young child, might be something like, okay, it has 4 legs, a furry coat, long tail, wet tongue, cold nose, friendly and fun, right? That might be, okay, if I see something like that, I know it's a doggy. But they might first see a cat and think of it in relation to their schema of doggy, 4 legs, furry, cold nose, and they might assimilate, and this is an important term why it's highlighted, assimilate would mean to add this example into their existing schema. But this could be a problem. If the new example doesn't fit quite into the schema, we receive correction and need to modify our understanding, and this is called accommodation. Another important term. You should understand assimilation and accommodation for sure. By accommodating or changing the existing schema and adding new characteristics to distinguish doggy from cat, we begin to understand and increase our knowledge and understanding of our world. And although Piaget studied the development of schemas and assimilation and accommodation in children generally, this process, don't think of it as stopping in childhood, right? This goes on throughout our whole lives. We bring in new information based on our experiences, okay? You could consider some different ways that you had a sort of concept in your mind, like this is what I think is how people go to school, right? But there are all different types of schools that you can learn about, and some people are now doing online schooling, or some people are doing homeschooling, or some people are foreign exchange students going to foreign lands, right? So we might have a schema for school when we're younger, and then we learn that there are all different types of schemas that actually There are all different types of schools, and we have to accommodate our schema a little bit. So an AP exam tip 1, be able to identify what it means to assimilate and accommodate schemas. This is often something that is one of those concepts, kind of like negative reinforcement and punishment, that students get confused on very easily. So make sure you have those clear and have a good understanding of what those are. So what are Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development? Piaget believed that children construct their knowledge, and that construct their knowledge, their understanding is very important. He's considered a constructivist. He believed that children construct their understanding of the world while they're interacting with it, almost like kids are little scientists. In Piaget's view, cognitive development consisted of 4 major stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, informal operational. So the sensory motor stage in Piaget's theory is the stage from birth to about age 2, during which infants know the world mostly in terms of their sensory impressions, what they can see, hear, smell, etc., and their motor activities. That would be why it's called the sensory motor stage. So how they smell and sense and feel and hear the world and how they move around. Object permanence is an interesting concept to think about. And you probably, if you haven't been exposed to Piaget, you may have never thought about it, but kind of intuitively been aware of this. If you've been around young infants at all. Young infants lack object permanence, the awareness that objects continue to exist even when not perceived. This is why babies love peekaboo. They think you're gone when you play peekaboo, but it's based on this concept that they have not yet learned object permanence. So very young babies seem to live in the present. Out of sight is out of mind. So in one test, Piaget showed an infant an appealing toy and then covered it with his hat. Before the age of 6 months, the infant acted as if the toy ceased to exist. But by about 8 months, infants began exhibiting memory for things they could no longer see, and they would search for the toy. They acquire, at that point, object permanence. So some criticism, though. Researchers believe Piaget and his followers underestimated young children's competence, and that to some extent, infants were smarter than Piaget had appreciated, right? While a lot of the things he came up with were groundbreaking, there are, of course, criticisms like with any psychologist that we'll talk about. Young children do think like little scientists. They test ideas, make causal inferences, and learn from statistical patterns. So this researcher devised impossible scenes for infants for an infant subject to view, such as a car seeming to pass through a solid object, a ball stopping in midair, or an object violating object permanence by magically disappearing. She saw that infants look longer and explore those impossible scenes. Why do infants show this visual bias? Because impossible events violate the infant's expectations. So she took kind of what Piaget had looked at and kind of went more in depth, kind of built upon his ideas to come up with some new information for developmental psychologists. Do infants have math sense? Psychologist Karen Wynn showed 5-month-olds 1 or 2 objects, then she hid the objects behind a screen and visibly removed or added one. When she lifted the screen, the infants sometimes did a double take, staring longer when shown a wrong number of objects. If you remember in, was it the last module or the one before that, if you listen to those ones, we talk about the term habituation. That's how developmental psychologists study infants, how long it takes for them, how long they're staring at things, basically. And if they've seen them before, they habituate and look away more quickly. So how about the pre-operational stage? In Piaget's theory, the stage from about 2 to 6 or 7 years of age is considered the pre-operational stage. And during this time, a child learns to use language, but does not yet comprehend mental operations of concrete logic. So one of the things that Piaget tested within, to kind of flesh out this stage was conservation. The principle of conservation, which Piaget believed to be part of concrete operational reasoning, that properties such as mass, volume, and number remain the same despite changes in the forms of objects. So how did he test for conservation? This is one of the most famous sort of experiments that within psychology, and some of you may have heard of it before. This visually focused pre-operational child does not yet understand the principle of conservation. When the milk is poured into a tall, narrow glass, it suddenly seems like more than an in a short, wider glass. And you can test this out on some younger kids if you know them to see if they have mastered conservation. Probably in another year or so, this girl would understand the amount stays the same. Doesn't matter what the glass size is. Pretend play is the acting out of stories which involve multiple perspectives, the playful manipulation of ideas and emotions, and the use of symbols. And you may think back, I have two very different children, and one of them has always been really into pretend play, still is. But you may be able to think back on if you were a young child that was very into using your imagination and acting out stories and engaging in pretend play. What research has been conducted on symbolic function in cognitive development? How does that relate to this? So psychologist Judy Deloche showed children a model of a room and hid a mini stuffed dog behind its mini couch. The 2.5-year-old subjects easily remembered where to find the mini toy, but they could not use the model to locate an actual stuffed dog behind a couch in a real room. 3-year-olds, only 6 months older, usually went right to the actual stuffed animal in the real room, showing that they could think of the model as a symbol for the room. So they could understand that that was a symbol for the room. How about egocentrism? In Piaget's theory, the preoperational child's difficulty taking another perspective. They have egocentrism at this stage. A 4-year-old girl shows her grandpa a match on 2 memory game cards with matching pictures that faced her, not her grandpa. You might have experienced this before if you were around very young children. When they're trying to show you something, they think they're showing it to you, but they're actually showing it to themselves. So what are some examples of egocentrism? So asked to show mommy your picture, 2-year-old Gabriella holds the picture up facing her own eyes. 3-year-old Gray makes himself invisible by putting his hands over his eyes, assuming that if he can't see his grandparents, they can't see him. 4-year-old Noah shows her aunt her new toys over a telephone call, thinking her aunt can see them too. So be careful. Egocentric is not the same as egotistical, a term you hear often in popular culture. Egocentric means you can't take someone else's point of view. Egotistical means you're pretty full of yourself. So theory of mind, a fascinating idea. So people's ideas about their own and others' mental states, about their feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, and the behaviors these might predict. How does this concept of theory of mind reveal itself? So with time, the ability to take another person's perspective develops. Children come to understand what might have made a playmate angry, when a sibling might share with them, and what might make a parent buy a toy. They begin to tease, empathize, and persuade when they've developed theory of mind. And when making decisions, developing children use their understanding of how their actions will make others feel. So how is theory of mind tested? This is a good visual right here. Children viewed a doll named Sally leaving her ball in a red cupboard. Another doll, Anne, then moved the ball to a blue cupboard. When Sally returns, where will she look for the ball? When asked the question above, 85% of the children in the study answered the question correctly. This showed that although the subjects knew the ball had been moved, they demonstrated theory of mind in knowing that Sally wouldn't know, right? So they realized that Sally wouldn't know where it is, even though they knew where it was. That means they've developed a theory of mind, according to these types of tests. Now, the concrete operational stage in Piaget's theory spans from about, and again, these are approximate ages, 7 years to 11 years of age, during which children gain the mental operations that enable them to think logically about events. So here's a little snippet of some child humor. Mr. Jones went into a restaurant and ordered a whole pizza for his dinner. When the waiter asked if he wanted it cut into 6 or 8 pieces, Mr. Jones said, "Oh, you better make it 6. I could never eat 8 pieces." You can think about maybe if you remember doing things like that, or if you have been around some children that do make those sorts of errors. This type of joke would be readily understood by a child in the concrete operation stage, but not in that pre-operational stage. Now, in Piaget's theory, the stage of cognitive development, normally beginning, again, on average, around age 12, during which people begin to think logically about abstract concepts. The characteristics that characterize the formal operational stage. By about age 12, our reasoning expands from the purely concrete, involving actual experience, to encompass abstract thought, involving imagined realities and symbols. As children approach adolescence, according to Piaget, they can ponder hypothetical propositions and deduce consequences. If this, then this. Systematic reasoning, what Piaget called formal operational thinking, is now within their grasp. So another important developmental psychologist beyond Piaget is Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky, pictured here with his daughter, was a Russian developmental psychologist. He studied how a child's mind feeds on the language of social interaction. Sorry about that. So as Piaget was forming his theory of cognitive development, let me make sure this is actually recording. Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky was also studying how children think and learn. Piaget emphasized how the child's mind went through interaction with the physical environment, and Vygotsky emphasized how the child's mind grows through interaction with the social environment. If Piaget's child was a young scientist, think about Vygotsky's as a young apprentice. One of the really important terms to think about when you're thinking about Lev Vygotsky, one that has proliferated for sure the educational environment, the educational realm, is the term of scaffolding, a framework that think about scaffolding building as a framework of support. And scaffolding within Vygotskyan theory is a framework that offers children temporary support as they develop higher levels of thinking. By giving children new words and mentoring them, parents, teachers, and others provide a temporary scaffold from which children can step to higher levels of thinking. So what was Vygotsky's view of child cognitive development? Effective mentoring occurs when children are developmentally ready to learn a new skill. For Vygotsky, to figure out if they were ready, you had to figure out if the learning was within their zone of proximal development. The zone between what a child can and can't do with the help of others is what the zone of proximal development is. Okay, so children learn best when their social environment presents them with something in the sweet spot. The learning shouldn't be too easy, that they don't even really have to think about it, and the learning shouldn't be too difficult that they can't figure it out. So switching gears a little bit to talk about autism. What is autism spectrum disorder? It's a disorder that appears in childhood and is marked by significant deficiencies in communication and social interaction, and by rigidly fixated interests and repetitive behaviors. It was once believed to be quite rare, about 1 in 2,500 people, but now about 1 in 68 American children get diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder by age 8. The reported rates vary according to location, interestingly, with New Jersey having 4 times the reported prevalence of Alabama. And while Britain's children have 1 in 100 rate, South Korea's children have a 1 in 38 rate of incidence of autism. The underlying source of autism spectrum disorder symptoms seem to be poor communication among brain regions that normally work together to let us take another's viewpoint. From age 2 months on, as other children spend more and more time looking into other people's eyes, those who later develop ASD or autism spectrum disorder do so less and less. People with ASD are said to have an impaired theory of mind, what we just talked about a few slides ago. So only 20% of children with autism answered the question correctly in that Baron-Cohen study, compared to the 85% of non-impaired children. Most answered that Sally would look in the blue cupboard, evidencing that they did not know. Sorry about that. Evidencing that they knew the ball had been moved, but not recognizing that Sally didn't know. So it's that perspective taking. They often don't understand, as well as other same age peers, how to take other people's perspective, to be able to step inside their shoes. ASD has differing levels of severity. About a half of people with ASD experience a fair or even a good outcome. Some generally function at a high level. They might have normal or above intelligence, accompanied by exceptional skills or talents in certain areas, but deficient social and communication skills. And often they tend to become distracted by irrelevant stimuli. Those at the spectrum's more severe end struggle to use language. So what do we know at this point? Studies suggest that the prenatal environment matters, although I'm going to read about a lot of this right here, but there's a lot we don't know, and I want you to keep that in mind. This is just, current as of the textbook publishing. There doesn't seem to be, based on studies that have done links to vaccinations, according to the textbook authors, biological factors, including genetic influences and abnormal brain development, seem to contribute to autism spectrum disorder. Is a diagnosis of ASD given more often for boys or girls? Well, definitely to boys, about 3 times as many boys. Psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen has a theory. He believes that this is because boys are often systemizers. They tend to understand things according to rules or laws, as mathematical and mechanical systems. Girls, he contends, are naturally predisposed to be empathizers. They tend to excel at reading facial expressions and gestures. So what research has he done? Well, Baron-Cohen and some colleagues collaborated with Britain's National Autistic Society and a film production company. Knowing that TV shows with vehicles have been popular among kids with ASD, they created animations with toy vehicle characters in a pretend boy's bedroom, grafting emotion-conveying faces onto toy trams, trains, and tractors, like this. After the boy leaves for school in this TV show, the characters come to life and have experiences that lead them to display various emotions. After viewing the TV programming, the child's subjects were asked to match the correct faces with the story, such as the neighbor's dog has bitten people before. He's barking at Louise. Point to the face that shows how Louise is feeling. So the results were that children were surprisingly able to generalize what they had learned to a new real-life context. By the intervention's end, Baron-Cohen's intervention's end, their previously deficient ability to recognize emotions on real faces now equaled that of children without ASD. Fascinating stuff, and great news that the intervention really helped these individuals with autism. So we are to our back to our learning target reviews. That was a lot of information. So let's go over these learning target reviews. The first one was to be able to describe how a child's mind develops from the perspective of Piaget, Vygotsky, and today's researchers. In his theory of cognitive development, Piaget proposed that children actively construct, think about constructivism, and modify their understanding of the world through the processes of assimilation and accommodation. Children form schemas that help them organize their experiences. Piaget has the 4 stages of development, progressing from the simplicity of the sensory motor stage of the first 2 years, in which infants and young children are developing object permanence. They then move to more complex ways of thinking. In the preoperational stage, from about age 2 to 6 or 7, most children develop the theory of mind. But they're still egocentric and unable to perform simple logical operations. Typically, by around age 7, children enter the concrete operational stage, and they're able to comprehend the principle of conservation. Think about the girl with the 2 cups, and she didn't realize that if they had the same amount and you poured them into a skinny tall cup, that they were still the same amount. One into a skinny tall cup and one to a short fat cup, but they're still the same amount. By age 12, children enter the formal operational stage and can reason systematically. Research supports the sequence Piaget proposed, but it also shows that young children seem to be a bit more capable than he may have originally believed. Vygotsky's studies of child development focused on the ways a child's mind grows by interacting with the social environment. He came up with the term of scaffolding, where parents and caretakers provide temporary sort of support, enabling children to step to higher levels of learning. Okay, finally, autism spectrum disorder is a disorder marked by social deficiencies and repetitive behaviors. Genetic influences, abnormal brain development, and the prenatal environment likely contribute to ASD, although there's still so much that is unknown in this area. An impaired theory of mind makes it difficult for those with ASD to understand others' point of view. People with autism experience different severities of the disorder. some functioning very high and having significant strengths in certain areas, while others struggle to even use language. So that was a lot of information, but I thank you for listening. Take care.